Julie came to Mrs. Clare's house and knocked on the door. "I'm coming." She could hear old Mrs. Clare scrambling to get to the door. The door opened and her neighbor stuck her head out. "Hi, what can I do for you?" she asked in a pleasant voice. Julie noticed the tired eyes, but the gentle smile as Mrs. Clare tried her best to be friendly. "Would you please let me borrow a cup of sugar? I forgot it at the market. You know me, always running. I can't keep up with myself anymore. Halloween is tomorrow night, so the kids are begging for homemade cookies." "That sounds like a party. Don't forget to put aside a few for your old neighbor," Mrs. Clare said. Julie felt a little bad for not spending more time with Mrs. Clare. When she moved here from North Carolina 10 years ago, Mrs. Clare had been always eager to help out. Julie used to go to Mrs. Clare when she needed a shoulder to cry on. Mrs. Clare's husband died the year before. Julie and her husband, Liam, moved to the neighborhood, and Mrs. Clare was glad to have new neighbors. Julie and Liam were newlyweds at the time. Liam had been away a lot with his new job, so Mrs. Clare had kept her company. Over the years, the couple had children, and she began to spend less and less time with Mrs. Clare. "Come in and take a sit." Mrs. Clare took the cup and slowly walked to her kitchen. "I have been meaning to stop by," Julie yelled back into the kitchen. It was a little quiet. Then she heard the shuffling of Mrs. Clare's slippers scraping back across the kitchen floor to the living room. She handed Julie a box of unopened sugar. "Oh no, I can't take the whole box," Julie said. "Just take it. I hardly ever bake anymore. Besides, I know how good your chocolate chip cookies are and I don't mind sharing," Mrs. Clare said. Julie had to laugh. Same old witty Mrs. Clare. Always looking at the bright side of things. She hugged her friend and took the box. "Thank you so much. I hate to leave so soon, but my kitchen cannot wait." "Won't you come over for a while?" Julie said. "Maybe some other time, dear. Just save me a cookie," said Mrs. Clare. "Of course," replied Julie. She politely took the sugar and turned to go home. She turned around again to say goodbye, but Mrs. Clare had already retreated to another part of the house. It was once again quiet. Julie ran home to get the cookies started before the kids got home from school. She had a lot to do. She felt a chill in the air as she closed the front door. Fall was setting in, crisp-colored leaves were everywhere, and other neighbors had neatly carved pumpkins sitting on their doorsteps. Halloween decorations lined the street. The winters in Wisconsin were brutal. She was enjoying the sunshine as she walked back to her house, eager to get the baking underway. Julie had worked hard all afternoon to decorate the table and the parlor with black and orange themed. The tablescape was creepy and cute at the same time with fake black spider and lace-designed paper plates and cups. Black cats and pumpkin decorations hung on the walls and around the table. The parlor door had been decorated with streamers and spider webs. Her chocolate chip cookies were baking in the oven. Liam would be home late from work, so she had a big pot of soup on for the children with some grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner. She figured it would take a couple of dozen cookies at least to fill all the goodie bags of the little goblins that would soon be ringing the doorbell. She looked in her collection for some spooky music to play later. Her children would be pleased. She was the designated party mom this year. She would not let them down. She ran to take the cookies out of the oven. Light and airy, sugar sweetness filled the air. She carefully placed them on the rack to cool, sitting out an extra plate for Mrs. Clare. When the children arrived, they were all excited to go in the parlor. First, before the treats, Julie sternly insisted, "You must have some soup and grilled cheese sandwiches." Mrs. Clare had coached Julie to teach the children discipline, and it was paying off now. They did as they were told and waited for the evening to arrive. Mrs. Clare was all alone in a big house. It was always so quiet. Now that she thought about it, Julie had not recalled seeing her in her garden or outside her house for quite some time. Raising the children and being a wife to Liam was time-consuming. She felt a sense of guilt. Mrs. Clare had been like a mother to her. How could she have forgotten to call on her neighbor more often? Had time really gone by so fast? It seemed like yesterday when she had come home from the hospital with her newborn baby. Mrs. Clare had been so happy for the birth of her firstborn. She came over to greet Julie with a pink frosted cake with little roses and balloons. It was getting late. Julie decided to slip out the back door and go visit her neighbor. She put on her black shawl to quell the chill in the air and went in the kitchen to get the warm plate of treats she had put aside for Mrs. Clare. As she walked over to get the cookies, she felt a strange sensation, like the hair on the back of her neck rising. She stepped on something warm and soft and noticed that a cookie had fell on the floor. She did not remember dropping it, but the children had not entered the kitchen or the parlor. She looked around the kitchen and did not see anything else unusual. The strange feeling passed and she walked out the back door and down the cobblestone street to the corner house where Mrs. Clare lived. She noticed that there were no Halloween decorations on the Clare house or in the yard, but there was a sign in the yard. She could not quite make out what it said in the dark. The house looked so lonely and quiet. Perhaps she is sleeping. Julie began to worry about Mrs. Clare's well-being. Something that had not occurred to her before. As she walked up the front steps to Mrs. Clare's house, she noticed that the front door looked strange. Raising her hand to knock, she noticed a doorbell. She felt her arm go numb as she rang the doorbell. It was still quiet. She rang the bell again. At last she heard footsteps, the click-clacking of hard shoes. Those did not sound like the slippers Mrs. Clare had been wearing earlier. She felt a sense of fear, which had nothing to do with it being Halloween night. A strange woman answered the door. "How may I help you?" she asked. "I am here to visit Mrs. Clare." "Is she home?" Julie asked. She looked into the woman's face. There was a strange resemblance to Mrs. Clare, but the woman was much younger. The woman's face suddenly went white. "Do you mean Natalie Clare?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Yes, she was just here this morning and I borrowed a cup of sugar. I made these chocolate chip cookies and promised to share with her." "Is she here?" Julie asked. The woman seemed to be gathering her composure as she looked at Julie with a puzzled look. "Natalie Clare was my mother. She has been dead for 10 years. This house has been unoccupied for a long time. I am her daughter, Anna. I was living in New York, but I moved here last week. Mom left the house to me. I could not bring myself to sell it, because I grew up here. But I think I will sell it after all because the memories are too painful. I put a sign in the front, did you see it? I thought maybe you were someone looking to buy it." Julie quickly put her hand over her mouth, trying to keep from saying any more that she might regret. Anna seemed to be uncomfortable and tried to end the conversation quickly. You must be mistaken, you could not have seen my mother, because she has been dead for 10 years. I have a lot to do, so if there is not something else, have a good night, Anna said. Julie apologized, and slowly walked away toward her own home. She could not hold back tears, and with disbelief of such devastating news, she kept trying to see through the windows. How could she be dead? Did I imagine that I had a conversation with her this morning? Then another thought, even stranger and sinister, weighed on her mind. I met her 10 years ago. A sick feeling hit her in the stomach. It was fear. Was she already dead? Perhaps it was her way of saying goodbye to a neighbor who had forgotten her. But wait, was she ever really my neighbor? All the conversations, all the friendly advice? Julie went over it again and again in her mind. She could not believe it, did not want to accept it. Suddenly the Halloween decorations looked too real, and the air felt even colder. She had to get home to the children. She kept up her quick pace and dared not look back. We hope you enjoy the story. Please subscribe for more videos.